What is the worst thing you've ever seen someone do at a funeral? A few years back, when the uncle of my mother died, my young cousin, 8, cried a lot at the funeral. It took some time, but eventually he calmed down and his parents went for a little walk with him for some distraction. But then he noticed that his first name was written on one of the tombstones. He mentions it loudly and one of the bystanders said, "Yeah, it's already reserved for you." He immediately started crying again. Her ex told us about all the great things she did in bed and what a loss for mankind that is. In presence of her boyfriend. I don't think I'll ever be able to forget Susie. And most of all, I will never forget that one night. Working late on the catalog. Just the two of us. And we surrendered to temptation. And it was pretty good. Die. It's like proposing at someone else's wedding. Just rude. Imagine somebody proposing at someone's funeral. My uncle was pissed about something in my grandmother's will. So during the funeral, he went out to the parking lot and keyed everyone's car. It should be noted, he has severe brain injury from a motorcycle accident that causes him to be constantly angry and paranoid. Still, damn bro, this probably one of the worst. What a pig. My nan told my dad at his own father's funeral that her pain was much greater because she had lost her husband, while he had only lost his dad. As if grief is a competition. She is a shitty person anyway. And not even blood related to us, so we just kinda don't associate anymore. My mother is like this. 25 years after they divorced, and she doesn't understand why it had any effect on me. It should not have, because it was her divorce, not mine. The gentleman had a large family and all of his siblings got up and made it all about themselves. Dredged up old family drama. Made it clear that they resented his wife, etc. It was so painfully awkward. Reminds me of the movie Knives Out. My husband went to his great aunt's funeral, and while they did the little ceremony in the cemetery, great aunt's granddaughters were all hiding behind a tombstone giggling and doing coke. Edit. Guys, her grandkids were like 17-23. I thought you were going say playing hide and seek behind the tombstone. That took a much different turn than expected. My mom passed 2 days before my first child was born. I didn't get pregnant again till 11 years later, so I was 5 months pregnant with my second child when my father passed. Someone came up to me at the funeral and said to me, "You should stop having kids. It's bad luck for your family." Outside looking, and I find the comment funny. But in the moment hearing that, I'd be pretty upset for sure. Nowhere near as bad as most comments, but the family didn't allow for his twin to speak. Straight up skipped over the allocated time for the living twin to get up and speak about his brother, who was his last remaining immediate family. I don't think I can ever forgive the late wife for putting him through that. She treated him so horribly all throughout the sickness. And then to not allow him to be a part of the funeral was the final nail in the coffin. Edit. I didn't think this would resonate with people, and I'm truly shocked. Please consider making a donation to your local cancer research foundation. Or donating stem cells. Cancer sucks. I went to the funeral of a co-worker's fiancé. The girl's ex showed up, and as people were lined up to say goodbye, we all witnessed him lean into the coffin and kiss her on the lips. I will repeat myself. The ex-boyfriend of the deceased woman kissed her dead body at her funeral. In front of her fiancé. Her brothers quite literally threw him out. Those are the best brothers. My husband's brothers put themselves on pedophile watch at my wedding just in case my great uncle decided to show up. My aunt crawled into her father's open casket. I knew a guy who climbed up into the casket with his grandfather. This one sweet and wholesome. He was around 4 years old. He wasn't sure what was going on. And people weren't giving him much attention. He asked someone what his grandfather was doing in a box at the front of the room. A relative, thinking they were explaining death in an age-appropriate way, told him that grandpa went to sleep and won't wake up again. So we went up to the casket and climbed up. The room froze in shock. Then he said, "Good night, Grandpa," and he kissed him. Adults told him later you could hear a pin drop and there wasn't a dry eye in the room. My sister murdered her father, my stepfather. At the time we didn't know she was guilty. BTW, just so you know, she did this purely for financial gain. During the viewing she drug her little boy to the casket, and because he didn't cry enough to suit her she pinched him on the upper arm until he was sobbing, then took him around to everyone saying he was really crying because he loved his grams so much. Not a funeral, but when my granddad passed and we went to view his body at the crematorium, my aunt started stealing from the facility the second the employee's back was turned. Just shoving anything that wasn't nailed down into her purse and pockets. Unbelievable. And yes, we called her out and made her put it all back. Do you mind me asking, WTF, the public spaces of a crematorium have worth stealing? My grandpa died. His son, my uncle, went around asking for money to give to his now widowed mother. He collected around $500 worth of donations from family, friends, etc. He pocketed it. And my grandma didn't receive shit. I hope he's been excommunicated from the family now. My brother-in-law is a mortician. Boy does he have stories. One of the best, a guy disguised himself as a nun. Shows up at the funeral. Pulls a gun from under his habit and tries to shoot the deceased's son. Luckily the gun malfunctioned and didn't fire. The son then decks the nun and knocks him out. Kicks him in the head a few times. And is pulled off by other family. Police are called. Yada yada yada. Turns out the deceased owed the nun quite a lot of money and the son had refused to honor the debt. At my father's funeral, one of my aunts asked my mom when would she get out of the house. It's always awful to hear about greed ruining the family over the deceased person's will. It really shows people's true colors and proves that they were just waiting for the person to die rather than trying to enjoy their remaining time with them. Always breaks my heart. Not at a funeral but at my auntie's wake. A dude approached my little sister and hit on her. She was 12 years old. This happened to me at my grandfather's retirement party. I was 12 and my grandfather's friends hit on me. They were all in their 70s. My uncle was cremated. He lived across from a lake and it was decided that we wanted his ashes spread on this little island on this lake. I was tasked with swimming with the urn from the boat to the island, holding it out of the water. I then stood at the edge of a small cliff with my nephews beside me and all the family watching in the boat. I opened the urn to dump his ashes over the cliff. We all say a few things. And as I go to dump the ashes, the wind picks up and blows the ashes all over my wet body. One of the worst things that ever happened to me. Priest called the deceased full of sin and refused one of his final requests, that his dog's ashes be buried with him. His son didn't care and snuck in his dog's ashes with his anyways. My uncle died and at his funeral my cousin, his son, was crying. Some old timer uncle came up to him and said, "Stop crying, you're a man, you're embarrassing us." I never wanted to slap someone at a funeral more than at that moment. You could have slapped that man right in the face and it would still be more appropriate than whatever the FCK he did. Not seen but experienced. My cousin's wife was kicking the back of my chair at my granddad's funeral. Also carrying on a conversation with my sister, who was supposedly really sad, the whole way through the service. For context, I was 14 and my cousin's wife was in her mid to late 30s. You were more mature than her. The officiant moved the partner of the deceased back a couple of rows. Because they weren't family. At least that was their initial reasoning. I'm sure it had nothing to do with the partner being same sex. I was furious. And then it got worse. The officiant decided to make the entire funeral about mental health. And how everyone should get help. Nothing about the life of the loved one. No celebration of their accomplishments. Of the beauty they brought to the world. Nothing. Keep in mind that 80% of the congregation still believed the death was because of physical health reasons. We would have coped with the knowledge. But telling us it was suicide only as a platform for the rest of us to seek help was heartbreaking. Only funeral I've ever rung and complained about. My uncle died. He was gay. My grandmother couldn't handle that. My uncle left a letter to be read at his funeral. I don't know if my grandmother planned it all alone or what. But gets to the part that says, "And to my nieces and nephews, I want you to know. Double quote. And instead of reading what was there, I know cause me and my dad helped my uncle write it. She went on this huge, insane tangent with tons of swearing about how none of us should be like him, commit his sins, etc. That he died of AIDS as a punishment. That was the most homophobic and hateful few minutes I can ever remember hearing. It was so disrespectful to everyone. And so terrible. She was an ugly person. A local boy died after being hit by a car while riding his bike. I think he was like 11/12 at the time. His sister, known to all to be very attention seeking, immediately was doing news interviews, which just seemed odd, considering he had died earlier that day. But whatever. People grieve differently, I suppose. But then at his wake, she took a few photos of him in the casket and posted it to her public Instagram story. It was super bizarre and just bad taste. I had a fit of hysterical laugh at my father's funeral just about the time people started to gather at the mortuary. In my defense, my mother had a nervous breakdown. My father died 4 days after we found out he had lung cancer. There was a lot of shitty stuff surrounding the funeral organization. My mom just flipped. My siblings were 15 and lost, so I was at 23 left to handle it all. I kinda lost it. Selfie with the corpse. Came here to say this. Even worse when the person used a large tablet. Someone's kid thought it'd be funny to give the corpse a wet willy. The kid was like 7 and I'm almost positive didn't even know the deceased. Their whole family dragged their kids out of the door and they did not return. Good. When my grandma died in the early 80s, kids were running up, touching her body, and running away laughing. My mom was furious and went around telling the parents. After the eulogist had talked for 45 minutes, the pastor went over to the lectern and politely asked him to conclude his eulogy. The guy boldly told the pastor, "I'll stop when I'm damn good and ready," and proceeded talking for about 20 more minutes. Close bracket. The total funeral church service lasted for 3/4 hours. It seemed endless. The Baptist preacher at my grandma's funeral tried to convert my Jewish family. Mom converted to marry my dad. Brother and I were raised Jewish. Said very pointedly that non-Christian family won't be able to reunite with her in heaven and other hurtful things directed at us. My grandma was very open and accepting of my mom's faith change. But this preacher was a total douche. Wrong place and time to try that. That's such a Baptist thing to do. Happened at my father's funeral too. They had an altar call telling people to come up and get saved so they don't go to hell. One of my students' mother died. I went to the funeral with the principal and the student's integration aide. After the funeral, her father walked up to her and her grandmother and said, "I want her out of the house by tomorrow morning." She was 11 years old. At my grandfather's funeral, one of the choir members essentially threw a tantrum and ended up interrupting one of my uncles who was giving a speech just because she wasn't given any food. The thing is, there wasn't any food at the funeral to begin with. The priest spent 20 minutes talking about how great God is and what an opportunity my uncle's death was for worship and solidifying faith. And not a f***ing word about my uncle. At least the relative who did that at my friend's funeral did talk about my friend a bit. He spoke of when she was a child. And the bond that their, quite large, family has. That was quite lovely. Because I'd known her for 38 years. Then he told us about himself. And his church. And Jesus. She was not a part of his religion. So. My cousin died at 14 years old from taking a dodgy ecstasy pill at a party. At her funeral, another cousin's boyfriend then proceeded to try and sell drugs. At her funeral. Last I heard, her dad found him and he and his friends kicked the guy's teeth in. My minister once told a story. He was waiting in a room off the sanctuary before the funeral when he heard scuffling noises. When he went to investigate, the brother and sister of the deceased had pulled the body out of the casket and propped it between them. They explained that they didn't have a recent photo of the three of them and were delighted he showed up to take the picture. Someone said, "I'm sorry for your loss. Move on." Double quote. You should listen to Cradle of Filth. It's gotten me through some bleak times. Watched my cousin's abusive, now ex-husband demand that his son not cry or show emotion at his grandmother's, my aunt, funeral, or else he would call him weak. Luckily, my dad was there and told him otherwise. The guy only showed up to the funeral anyway because he was constantly hounding my cousin about how much money my aunt had left her. This is a story my father told me from when he was a child in the 1940s. There was a named church beside the farm where he grew up in rural SC. The church had no electricity. There was a funeral there one evening and the church was lit throughout with candles. The church building had existed since just after emancipation and was in really bad shape. The flooring had been severely damaged by termites. During the funeral, the floor gave way, making the casket tumble and the body fall out. Everyone ran out of the church in terror. Making matters worse, the candles that were on the casket fell to the floor and set the church on fire. The whole community watched outside as it burned to the ground. When my father died, his BTCH second wife had compiled a playlist of all his favorite songs. Jimi Hendrix's national anthem rendition from Woodstock started playing. My half-brother made a funny comment to help lighten the mood and said, "Hey mom, it's your favorite song," because she didn't enjoy it. And she instructed my brother to turn it off. She also did not introduce myself and my aunt and uncle, my father's sister and her husband, to anyone at the funeral. Barely acknowledged us. Fucking CNT till the very end. And she had the audacity to try and say she loved me in front of everyone, and I just looked at her and left. A good friend of mine works in a hospital ward and has a guy who fell into his sister's grave and became paralyzed. He was down there for hours before they managed to get him out. I get this isn't an intentional bad thing, but I bet it sucked and I feel sorry for everyone involved, especially that dude. Friend of mine was shot and killed by the police shortly after high school. Long story, but the short version is he lost access to his psych meds and started breaking down. Stumbled into someone's backyard and passed out. Woke up the police screaming at him and he was shot. A guy we all knew in high school showed up at his funeral. After he was buried and people were sitting around in shock. He starts giving a speech about how this isn't right. Isn't what he would have wanted. And turning it into something about him. He ended up getting tackled by a few people and basically forced to leave. At my grandfather's wake. My mother's dickhead sister, I don't consider her family to myself anymore, sequestered herself in a coat room. Bawling. Throwing herself a pity party. Because no one was talking to her. Why? Because her boyfriend drugged and sexually assaulted my brother and she stuck by her boyfriend's side the whole time. Family who didn't know the circumstances of her being a pariah showered her with sympathy because we were all being so mean to her. Cunt. At my dad's funeral, one of his old bandmates, from about 15 years ago at the time, promoted his new band. It was at the part where people go up to the mic and say some kind words, speeches, etc. My dad killed himself and some dude used it as a marketing opportunity. There was also a pastor there who was playing hymns. My dad was an atheist. My dad was also dead for over a week. His side of the family decided to have an open casket. Still had rope marks around his neck. There was the stench of decomposition that filled the room. Ugh. Two different situations. 1. When I was 10 at my grandpa's funeral. A relative told me I was lucky for being so young because now I'll never miss my grandpa. 2. At my grandma's funeral. Her neighbor asked us if he could stop by the house that day and take some stuff off of our hands, no offer of money. Just wanted free stuff. My uncle relentlessly flirted with a funeral home employee. While at his dad's funeral. She was obviously deeply uncomfortable and he was so narcissistic he thought she was interested. My aunt tried to make it all about her and my cousin. This happened to me. When my dad passed, my grandma and his girlfriend didn't include us, his kids, in anything. We were ignored. Then his GF decided to do a yard sale of all his things before we knew it. Get annoyed and cause a scene because her daughter's name was not on a list of people that will miss him. In all honesty, she should have been there. But no reason to cause a scene then and there. A friend of the family with a notorious drinking problem showed up to the visitation and service extremely intoxicated. She is not a sad drunk. She is a happy, huggy drunk, so she went around sloppily hugging everyone, even people she didn't know. She slurred introductions and condolences to everyone for about an hour, then tripped over a settee in one of the sitting rooms of the funeral home and face planted. My grand sister died recently and they were holding a service at my aunt's house before the burial. My gran, closing in on 90, deaf as a post and suffering from vascular dementia, lost patience with the celebrant as she was about halfway through the reading and loudly announces, "Oh, will she know, just bloody shut up," at the top of her voice. My poor mum was completely mortified, although the rest of the family was very understanding. Luckily, no one returned the favor at my grand service the following year. I read a news article about Americans drones striking a funeral. That's probably the worst thing I've seen someone do at a funeral. Hell's Angels doing a driverby on a funeral in Buffalo was a lot of fun as well. At my friend's funeral last year, one of her relatives got up and gave a eulogy that was all about himself and his place of worship. That was pretty infuriating, given that she was not a part of his religion. At a different friend's funeral, also last year, her sister sang an incredibly heartfelt and incredibly poorly performed song while playing guitar earnestly but, at best, averagely. We gave her more applause than she strictly deserved, but less than a standing O. It felt really weird to be applauding at such a small, non-celebrity funeral. No one really seemed to know where to draw the line between support of the grieving sister and proper deportment at a funeral. At my father's wake, my niece went up to the casket to see my dad before they closed it for good, and she dropped her chewing gum out of her mouth onto his suit. She was too freaked out to pick it up, so she just walked away. She was 17, should have known better. Heck, if she's even remotely human. The embarrassment of that event will keep her up nights randomly for the rest of her life. So there's that. At my grandmother's funeral, the casket was being lowered into a grave right next to my grandfather's. It was a very somber moment and a lot of people were crying. Except for the funeral director. She was grinning ear to ear. This was not a quick smirk. She was positively beaming through all this misery. And she was making no effort to hide it. She was standing right by the tombstone where everyone could see her. Happy as can be. I can understand appreciating a job well done. But Jesus Christ. Have some decorum. The granddaughter of the deceased started a fire in the church bathroom during the funeral. No idea why she did it. She wasn't mentally well, though. And her grandmother's death really messed her up. Luckily it was put out pretty quickly and didn't cause much damage. Odd thing was that it was the men's room and not the women's. Show up really. Especially when you're the ex known for sleeping around with the dude's friends while he was away in military training before he killed himself. Funerals where I'm from involves a lot of drinking, singing, and sometimes even gambling. I don't think there's a year where we never hear a news about someone getting severely beaten or a brawl breaking out at a funeral. I've only witnessed it once though. My story isn't as heinous as some of these. But, when my wife's grandmother passed a few years back, we arrived at the cemetery with the funeral procession. And they hadn't even dug the hole yet. They did the entire graveside ceremony thing with a casket sitting on a gurney in the grass. All the while, there's a guy waiting in a backhoe just up the hill. It all seemed so strangely, I don't know, unprofessional. At my grandmother's funeral, some developers were building houses not far from the gravesite, pretty much right next to the cemetery. During the graveside service, the builders were working and listening to the radio, and whatever station they were listening to played AC/DC's Hell's Bells. Yeah, I had to hear Hell's Bells during my grandmother's funeral. When my mom passed, pretty much all of my relatives started to tell stories of how they'd helped my mom and how indebted we should be to them, hoping to get either money or material possessions out of it. Even during the funeral itself, Truth was I was there in almost all of these particular experiences, and not only did they help very little, if at all, but they tried to downplay my mom's backbreaking effort to give me and my siblings a good enough life. It's then and there that I lost any faith I had in my remaining relatives and family. A tough lesson to learn, but a valuable one nonetheless. I guess not it, but after my dad's eye was holding his urn and looked at it, and oh, good news guys. Dad's recyclable. Apparently at my grandma's funeral my uncle's phone went off with "hooked in a feeling" as his ringtone. All quiet and then just "Yuga Chaka." We're not a very serious family though, so all of this was met with good humor lol. My cousin had left Pure Romance, shitty MLM that sells SX toys and accessories, and had a bunch of leftover items taking up space in her house. She decided the perfect venue for getting rid of all these unwanted items was my grandfather's funeral. I got coochie cream.